Hello, everyone. We're excited to have you join us today for our webinar on enabling NetDevOps through CI/CD pipeline integration with Itential. Before we dive in, my name is Morgan Stern. I'm the VP of Automation Strategy at Itential, and I'm joined today by Dan Sullivan, who's a Principal Solution Engineer for Itential. How are you doing today, Dan?
Great, Morgan. Looking forward to the demo.
Thanks. During today's webinar, we'll be describing how teams can evolve towards NetDevOps by leveraging the Itential automation platform to provide network services to CI/CD pipelines. If you have questions, please ask them along the way in the chat window and we'll answer them in chat. So let's get started. To set the stage, I wanted to review some of the key points from one of our earlier CI/CD webinars. One of the things that we've seen in the field is that the friendliness of CI/CD tools really varies by networking domains. I think when you look at domains like cloud, the tooling is relatively mature and really super functional. When you start to get into some of the physical network domains, so things like optical or IP, it's a little bit less of an environment that is sort of tooled for CI/CD, and subsequently, a lot of the capabilities that exist are just not as easy to work with. So, in addition, networks and network services present some unique challenges when you think about the concepts around pipelines and traditional CI/CD deployments. When you're moving from deploying an application that is relatively kind of static to a version versus some network services that are a lot more dynamic. So things like VPNs or SD-WANs, a lot more dynamic of a service. It's a little bit different in how you're going to roll those out when you're looking to integrate with a pipeline versus doing it in a traditional network provisioning activity. So what we start to see is the way people are using tools vary greatly across different environments. Really depends on what are the technologies that they have in play, what are the skill sets that the folks have that they bring to the table, what tools are they familiar with. See a lot of different folks implementing CI/CD and DevOps practices on their network, but in different ways. And some of the teams are doing some really very cool, very advanced stuff. And so in those environments where you do have folks that maybe bring skills from previous projects or previous technologies, they're starting to do some really interesting things that are enabling them to get better predictability and better outcomes in the way that they're deploying applications and network capabilities. Now, in some environments, I want to talk about what we see in the field, which is we have the application developers have developed a relatively robust, mature pipeline, but the pipeline hasn't yet been integrated to incorporate it in the network services. So the developer will develop their new branch, they'll do their merge request, it'll get approved, it'll go to staging, it'll get deployed to production. But before the end users can actually access the application, there's some set of network services that need to get provisioned. So in some environments, once the application is deployed, well, then tickets get generated to create firewall rules or to create VPNs or to add DNS records or to add the new systems to the load balancer. And only then, once all of those activities are done, the application is considered to be deployed successfully. So we have this tremendously automated pipeline that gets to the point of deployment, and then the process stops. And then the tickets get created, and each one of those tickets may go to a different team with a different SLA. And then once all of those things are done, that's when the application deployment is considered to be complete. Now, there's a tremendous opportunity for those activities to get integrated into the pipeline. The challenge is, how do you do that in a way that makes sense? Right? You need to move away from these manual activities. You need to move away from these ticket activities in order to be able to integrate all of those changes into the larger pipeline. And that's really what we're talking about today. But to do that, you kind of need to think about what are the tools and what does the tooling look like in a pipeline, right? What you see on the screen right now is 5 different categories, relatively well understood, relatively agreed on categories of tools for pipelines. So for managing and tracking software code changes, people are using source and version control tools. There's also a set of continuous integration and deployment tools for automating the build, unit testing, deployment activities. There's infrastructure provisioning that's primarily focused around cloud and infrastructure activities. There's container orchestration and container management for being able to manage and deploy and operate the pods. And then there's a set of monitoring tools. And what we're suggesting here that in order to move from that model where you have all of the software activities highly pipelined, but the networking activities not, what we're proposing is there's this category of functionality that we're calling network services in this case that we can expose and define tooling and define requirements so that we've got this consistent method for teams that are developing on pipelines and other teams to be able to consume network capabilities. So the more that you can expose this in a similar way to those other categories of tools, the easier it becomes to consume some of those network services capabilities like DNS record creation, like firewall rule creation, like VPN, almost as a microservice kind of consumption model. Now, at Itential, uh, you've kind of if you've attended some of our webinars, you know that we really have focused on the ecosystem model and thinking about how do we operate within the context of this world of consumers and domains and network technologies and systems. And so, what you'll see here on this slide, this is a kind of detailed view of the Itential architecture. But what I want to focus on is the fact that any bit of functionality that's provided within this model is something that can be exposed as a microservice, that can be exposed as a service that can be consumed as a pipeline, which Dan will show you in the demo, and subsequently becomes this platform for all of these network services. Not just, hey, I created a script or I created a workflow and I want to expose that, but really some of the very atomic functionality that exists within the Itential platform. So we do have the ability to expose a workflow. We also have the ability to expose pre-built components, but at the same time, all of those functionalities within config management for configuration lifecycle management, meaning things like being able to read a config, make a change to a config, back up a config, define compliance rules, run compliance checks. So, for example, within a pipeline, if somebody wanted to check to make sure that before they established a change to the network, that the systems were compliant with the standard config, you can run just that compliance check as part of the pipeline and move on from there. We also provide templates and data transformations, which become objects that can be called. So if somebody wants to do pre-checks or they want to do a data transform, they can just call that function. And we've got the automation catalog, which is any assets that get custom created by the users can then be exposed for consumption by the pipeline. Additionally, anything that the system is connected to southbound can be exposed for consumption as a service to the pipeline. So for all of the SD-WAN controllers, all of network controllers, all of the cloud systems that we're integrated with, we can expose all of that functionality as callable network services to the folks that are on the consumption side on the northbound. Through the internet or through the Itential Automation Gateway, IAG, we can also expose access to any playbooks, any Terraform plans, any Python scripts that are onboarded to IAG, as well as all of those systems that we're connected to. So any systems that we're either communicating through APIs, communicating through CLI, through NetConf, all of those capabilities become this huge library of assets that can be exposed to the pipeline for consumption as a network services server. So if we go back to the previous model where initially we had the pipeline would run and then there was a stop and then I would need to create tickets, all of those capabilities can get integrated into the pipeline. So starting it all the way over on the left, you can use a function to generate the config. Once the config has been created, you can then make a call out to during the testing phase to be able to interact with the firewall, with the VPN, with the load balancer. You can use all of the feedback that you get from those systems to become part of what then gets approved for the merge. Once it's then approved for the merge, all of the payloads have been generated to make all of the changes to the network that can be deployed to the network. You can use then the IP server to deploy all of those changes in a secure way where you've got all of the assurance of doing the pre-checks and post-checks. You've already got the things that have been tested. Everything just becomes part of one pipeline. So instead of all my app stuff happening first and then I wait, everything can be done in line. And because it's all been automated and orchestrated and tested, you eliminate all of that idle time where those tickets were sitting in somebody's queue waiting to be worked. What I'm going to do now is hand things over to Dan. He's going to show a demo of how all this functionality works, and then I'll be back at the end to wrap things up. Dan?
Thanks, Morgan. So I think we've got sort of the demo architecture up here at first, and maybe we'll just review this and then we'll sort of get to it. I think the first thing that we'll talk about is what you can see here is that we have an application deployment pipeline. The first three stages, you see infrastructure create, application deployment, some unit tests, and then you see a series of different requests, whether it's a network health check or a DNS resource request. And each of these services is actually going to be accomplished by Itential. And the way that it'll work is that each stage in the pipeline can independently access and request a specific service. So I know that many of you who might be familiar with Itential know that you can actually build fairly large end-to-end sort of encompassing workflows. But as Morgan suggested, and sometimes in these application pipelines, what we really need is very discrete services. And in a sense, the pipeline itself is actually acting as sort of an orchestrator, if you will. Now, today's example will focus on a GitLab pipeline, but it's also possible to affect the same sort of change in other technologies, whether that's GitHub using GitHub Actions, Jenkins, even ServiceNow and Salesforce to an extent. You know, Itential is largely agnostic to the calling technologies, and today's demo really just focuses on utilizing these Itential API calls. You know, the first few steps are the application deployment part, aren't really the focus of the demo. I'm sure many of you deploying your own applications know more about how to do that and the appropriate way to do it, considerably more so than I can actually show you today. So the focus on today's demo will largely be on, you know, Itential incorporating those network services into a pipeline. Looking at sort of the distinct phases, we'll see the network health check, IP resource allocation, basically allocating a resource, an IP address from info blocks. We'll actually create a DNS record in info blocks, provision an F5 load balancer, actually create an ACL in a data center switch. Obviously, we could switch that out just as easily and be talking to Panorama and provisioning some sort of firewall policy. And then lastly, some port turn up and actually in a notification. And again, you know, largely in many customers we talk to, all of these steps are sort of handled, as Morgan was sort of alluding to, in sort of a ticket-oriented manual process. But we'll actually show you how you can do this in an automated fashion and really deploy your application and the network services required in a single pipeline. The systems that we're going to sort of focus on for the purposes of the demo will be the Itential Automation Platform, and we'll use that to execute some Itential workflows and an Itential command template. And then we'll also make some calls directly to the Itential Automation Gateway to execute an Ansible playbook that we have previously defined. Although we're showing an Ansible playbook today, you can easily extend this to some sort of scripts or a set of Python scripts that you might have onboarded that are providing specific task-based automation. You can easily do that as well. We'll use info blocks to reserve an IP address and create a DNS record, an F5 load balancer, as I mentioned, to provision a VIP, and then the data center switch itself. And then lastly, we'll send out some notifications on completion of the pipeline using MS Teams and Slack. I think it makes sense to sort of jump into the demo here. So let me just share my screen. All right, and I will quickly jump into the platform itself. You'll see here that I'm in the Itential platform, the Itential Automation platform, and let's talk about some of the parts of the components of Itential that we'll be utilizing. So one of the first things we'll do is we'll actually execute a command template. And the focus of the command template will actually be a device that we want to leverage within the automation. So we'll run a series of commands against this device. In this case, you'll see we don't actually have any rules provisioned, so this will pass fairly quickly. But you can certainly apply more comprehensive checks and things like that against a device or a series of devices that are going to be involved in your deployment. We could actually run that right from here if we wanted. So here's the device that we'll actually be using in the pipeline itself, so we can actually run this. Let's see what happens. So it's taking a second to run, but it should be done. And then you can see the output below here. It looks like it passed. It went out and did a show version, checked the ports. So it looks like we're good to go there. So we'll actually run the same thing, but do it via an API call from Itential. And I've actually created another version of this that's a little bit more strict, and I'll explain why in just a few moments. Next is just the IP resource reservation. So that's right here where we're just going to run this workflow. We'll go off and get the next available IP address from info blocks. And then we'll save that and actually return that in the output of the automation. And the purpose here is that we actually want this IP address, and we're actually going to use this data in a few of the other stages that we see. Now, all of these workflows that we're showing are actually have what we call an operations manager entry associated with them. So for example, here's the one for the IP resource reservation. So you see that I've created a special endpoint here, and I've defined a route. And this is the actual route that GitLab the GitLab pipeline will actually execute when they call this particular automation. You can see over on the right-hand side of the screen, I can actually set read and write groupings here. So these are sort of LDAP groups. And that's useful because I may want to expose a series of automations that are applicable for a given pipeline, but I don't necessarily want to expose every automation that I have to my pipeline. So I can certainly use the read and write groups to restrict who can see the triggers and who can actually access them and who can execute them more importantly. On the DNS side, we also have a separate workflow here. And this is actually an Itential pre-built. So if you were to go to our website, this is publicly available. So we just downloaded this, and we're going to use this. We're going to drive this. Now, this particular workflow can create pretty much any type of record within info blocks. In our case, we'll just use it specifically to create an A record. And we have a specific workflow, specific endpoint, again, an operations manager, just like we did for the IP resource reservation that we're going to use. And we're going to do the same thing for the F5 VIP here. This is also part of a pre-built package we have. And we will go off and create the VIP for that. Let's see. I guess I don't have that one up here, but I'll do that right now. Yeah, so here's the workflow for the F5 VIP, and we will call this, and this will actually go to the F5 and provision the VIP for us. Now, lastly, we have and one of the last stages of the pipelines, we need to create an ACL, and we'll actually do that by calling an Ansible playbook that we've onboarded into the Itential Automation Gateway. In this case, we'll go directly to the Itential Automation Gateway. We don't necessarily need to go through IAP. So we'll actually do that here in the gateway itself. So if we went down and looked at the series of playbooks that we had onboarded already here, we'll call this data center ACL playbook to actually go off and provision a ACL for us for this use case. And then lastly is just a broadcast notification where we will go off and actually send some notifications into a MS Teams channel and Slack and a Slack channel. So we've got a few different options here, but we'll take a look at the MS Teams channel once we kick this off. So now that we've sort of seen all of the Itential artifacts that we're going to be leveraging, we have the pipeline itself. So first off, before we jump in and show you the pipeline, I've got a few different variables. I've got an application name that I'm going to use. I think I called it the SC demo app. And I've got an application port. I've got a particular switch defined, and this this variable DC switch health check actually defines the particular template that I want to run. You'll see here that I have it set to this DC switch health check, but when we get to the run the pipeline, I'm going to play around with that a little bit. Here's the pipeline itself. I've got my pipeline restricted to only run manually, but that's mostly just because it's for a demo. And we have those application stages up front here, and then we start jumping into the stages that are actually going to provision the network. What you'll notice, though, is that I've actually made some Python wrappers. So there's two scripts, iap.py and iag.py. And you can see here, I'm actually calling one right here when I'm doing the health check. And then you'll see the same script being called again when I'm actually running an automation. The idea here is that I just want to put a little bit of a wrap around making the API call, interpreting the result, and being able to present something in the course of the pipeline to make the demo a little bit easier to read. But there's not too much special there in terms of these scripts, just something that probably wrote over the course of a couple of hours. So now the one other interesting thing that the IAP script can do is that we can actually prompt it to read specific aspects of the output of a job request. So if there's data that I want to pass between stages, the iap.py script will generate a build.env file, and then later stages can actually reference that. And you can see the rest of these stages. We're simply just calling these scripts. We're using some of the variables. You'll see up here when we run this reserve IP address, we're going to actually save the IP address. We're going to extract that, make it a environment variable, and then later on, subsequent stages down here will actually leverage that IP address. And the same thing goes for the F5 stage, the firewall, the notification. All those things, all those stages will run in roughly the same fashion. So now it's actually time we can actually kick off the pipeline here. So I've got sort of a manual input here. So what I'm actually going to do, though, is I'm going to override the template name for the health check. So I'll show you why in just a second. So I'm going to add on this, I'm going to specify this command template to run. And the reason why is I actually made a slightly different health check for this one. And let's see if I have it up here. Yep, where I'm actually checking for a later version of software than I have. And I'm also going to check to see if NTP is enabled. And if I see disabled, I'm going to generate an error. So actually, because I know that NTP isn't actually enabled on this switch, I'm actually expecting it to fail. But it'll give us a little bit of an idea about how you might incorporate some of these in it. So the first time we run this, it actually should fail, but that's okay. And that'll give us a little bit of an indication of what we're doing here. So the pipeline's now running. We've got the first few stages going to run here, and they'll run pretty quickly. They don't do too much. Like I said, most of you out there probably have a much better concept of what you want to do from an application deployment perspective. And you probably wouldn't learn much from something I put together. So hopefully we'll run quickly and we'll get to the data center piece of this. It'll just take just a couple of seconds. Now, the interesting thing here with these pre-checks is that we can actually have these defined by a network expert, right? So some subject matter expert that understands the network and the set of meaningful pre and post checks can actually design these within the confines of Itential and make them API accessible. Now, the good news is that the overhead and the maintenance for this isn't necessarily going to be associated with the application team running the pipeline. They can just consume these services, and really the only part that they have to maintain is the API call. That's actually fairly simple in and of itself, right? We're just going to call that template. So let's see what happens here if we click in. So it looks like the data center health check failed. So you'll see up here, we've gone down and we are executing this this command template here. This is sort of the output from the script. You'll see some detailed output here saying that the show version ran, and we have the show interface status command ran, and then down here we'll have an evaluation of how that worked out. And you'll see overall it says that the command template failed. You'll see that the show version failed. That was only a warning, so we probably would have gotten by with this. But we also see that the show NTP access failed, and that generated an error. So that caused the entire template to fail, and thus the pipeline stopped. So just to give you an idea of how you can actually incorporate these changes and actually pretty easily impact the pipeline itself. So if we just were to go back and try this again, and we don't override that, I think we'll get a little bit further this time. So let's just try it again. So hopefully we should get through this a little bit quicker, a little bit repetitive here, but at the same time now we should hopefully we'll get a little further and we'll start seeing some access from some of these later stages. And while we're doing that, I think it also makes sense. We'll actually look at the F5 here for a second, and I'll log in quickly. See if I can beat the demo here. And you'll see that there's no F5 VIP created. And the same thing over here, you'll see that there's no VIP created either. So the pipeline hasn't progressed this far, and the DNSA record doesn't exist either. So if I jump back into the pipeline here, we're getting ready to, just getting close to jumping in here. We're almost done with the application unit test. And we should be off, and we'll start seeing some of these services get created, and we'll take a closer look at those once they kick off. And it looks like the health check is just about to pass. So let's take a quick look. Yeah, and so it says here that the command template passed, so the pipeline is going to proceed. So if I go back, you'll see that if I refresh this, it should say that it's passed. So it passed, so that phase passed, and now we're into reserving the IP address and info blocks. So let's take a look at that, see what's happening here. So the container is just getting ready. They got the Git, looks like the Git repo is copied over there. And we're going to kick off in just a second here. So let's see what happens. So here you can see that we've kicked off the Itential automation via an IP address, via a REST call. So we're going to allocate an IP address. So you'll see here we kicked it off. We get a job ID back from Itential saying this is the job ID of the automation we're going to run. And now we're actually waiting for it to complete. It looks like it completed already. And then if we go down here, there's actually some output data here. So here's the IP address that's actually been allocated from this particular workflow. And then you'll see down here that we're going to turn that into an environment variable so we can consume it within the pipeline. And that looks like it worked out okay. We got good status back on that. And we can actually validate that by, if we went into operations manager, if we go to the dashboard here and we take a look at our job manager, we can actually see what's going on here. So let's see here. I went the wrong way. Let's take a look at the job manager here. Okay, we actually start seeing some of these pipeline calls actually executing. So if we go back to the pipeline itself, if I go back here, refresh this a bit, you'll see now that we reserve the IP address. If we look at the DNS record, the same thing is happening, right? We're just going to create another record here. We're going to create the A record in there, and you'll see that we actually passed in the IP address we allocated here into the payload. We gave it a name, so we prepended. We took the demo application name we had saved, and we passed that in there. And then later on down here, you'll see that we get a message back from the automation saying that the A record was successfully completed. And then we're off to the next phase. So you can see we're actually executing these discrete functions in each different stage. So if we go back here again, and we looked at the next stage, which is basically just configuring the F5. A similar thing here where we're asking the F5 to go off and create this. When we retrieve the details of the automation here, you can see up the top here. We started the automation, we got a job ID. Again, we're waiting for it. Once it's done, we retrieve the status. The automation itself is telling us that it completed. We have no errors here, so that's good. It's showing what we passed into it, and we're going to call the VIP SC demo app -VIP. And we've already selected a pool name. Obviously, if in a real production deployment, you may have more data. Maybe you're actually going to define the pool at the same time. But for the purposes of this automation, we sort of shortened it up a little bit. But you can see here that everything looks like everything worked out correctly. So if I went back to the F5 and I take a look at the status, you'll see here that the VIP actually did indeed get created. And the same thing from info blocks here. If I go in, I should see an A record created as well. And you'll see that the A record is successfully there. And lastly, if I went off here and looked, you'll see actually I got a notification saying that the GitLab pipeline has successfully completed, and I have some data about the DNS name that I allocated and the application name and the IP address I allocated. So we basically got pretty much positive results from the pipeline itself. So if I go back here, you'll see again that all of the stages executed correctly. The firewall rule stage was one of the next ones. And if we just look at that correctly, that one's a little different because in this case, we went directly to IAG. So we used the IAG script to actually kick this off. And once we install pip, and it looks like NetMiko there, you'll see that we kicked off the IAG script, and it's telling us it's creating a rule, and it went off, executed the playbook in the confines of IAG, and then we got back success in the status, so we know that the playbook executed successfully, and we were able to provision that data center switch. And then lastly, what we can do again is just to look a little bit at the job management. So you can see that the tasks here that we ran, the notifications, the DNS, uh, info blocks a record create, um, and the get next available IP address, all of those completed during uh, the pipeline itself. So those are sort of the automations we kicked off. So we actually saw how we can really easily start using these discrete networking functions and execute them from the confines of a pipeline. Um, and again, what we're showing today with GitLab is no different than what you would see um, using another similar tools, whether it's Jenkins or GitHub Actions. But the idea here is that the interface between the pipeline and Itential is actually fairly simple, right? We're calling the script with a few arguments. There's a REST payload here that we're populating using variables. And we're sort of using this over and over again for multiple stages. The data is a little different, but the payload is fairly simple. And this is really allowing us to have to keep the complexity where it should be. So we don't necessarily need to directly integrate with all these systems. We're merely talking to Itential, and it's going to do it on our behalf. And that's going to allow us to maintain a high level of security. We're not going to expose all those disparate systems to the pipeline itself, but we'll actually just talk to Itential, and we can add new functionality as it becomes available, or we can change payloads fairly easily, and we don't have to worry about what version of the system we're talking to. That's sort of an Itential problem. We don't necessarily have to deal with that in the confines of the pipeline. So that's all I really had for today's demo. Um, Morgan, anything else that you'd like to say?
Pretty cool. I mean, it's really pretty remarkable how many different things you kind of were able to accommodate across the pipeline. So that was awesome, and thank you, Dan. I really was really we really appreciate that demo.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, folks, and with that, wanted to thank everybody for attending the session. I think that it certainly is eye opening to kind of see all of the different pieces to come together in the way that Dan was able to do that. Um, so we hope you enjoyed this session. We've got some upcoming sessions that we'll be sending out notifications about, where we'll continue to explore CI/CD and other related topics. But with this, I'd like to close and just say thank you once again for attending.